The rebels who rode onto James Wilson's farm that autumn morning made two fatal mistakes. First, they assumed that a man in a wheelchair couldn't protect his land. Second, they never questioned why his weathered hands bore the same calluses found on elite military snipers. But by the time they realized their errors, it would be too late, both for their pride and their ill-conceived plans for Pine Valley. Before we dive deeper into this story of courage and redemption, tell us where you're watching from. If this tale of hidden strength speaks to you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's story will show you that appearances can be the most dangerous kind of deception. The October wind whispered through the cornfields of Willow Creek Farm, carrying the scent of fresh-cut hay and approaching rain. James Wilson's wheelchair left precise tracks in the morning dew as he made his final inspection of the day's harvest preparations. At 45, his arms were still corded with muscle, not from military training anymore, but from years of refusing help with tasks others thought impossible for a man in his condition. "Dad!" Sarah's voice carried from the farmhouse porch. "Tom's on the phone. Says it's important." Jim turned his chair with practiced efficiency, noting how his 19-year-old daughter tried to hide her concern. Sarah had her mother's eyes, the same ones that had watched him rebuild his life after the explosion that took his legs and her mother's life 3 years ago. "Sheriff Anderson." Jim's voice carried the quiet authority that had once commanded. "Elite military units. What's got you calling so early?" Tom Anderson's response made Jim's fingers tighten on his armrests. The rebel group that had been causing trouble up north was moving south, targeting isolated farms and small communities. 3 properties had been raided in the past week alone. "They're calling themselves the Free Riders," Tom explained. "Led by a guy who goes by Snake, ex-military, but the dishonorable discharge kind. Been recruiting troubled veterans, giving them a cause to fight for, even if it's the wrong one." Jim watched Sarah directing David Murphy, their farmhand, in loading the morning's harvest. She'd stepped up after the explosion, refusing to let him sell the farm despite his injuries. Like him, she understood that some battles were worth fighting, no matter the odds. "How many?" Jim asked, his mind automatically assessing tactical possibilities. 15 confirmed members, probably more. "Jim." Tom hesitated. "Maybe you should consider staying in town for a few days, at least until we get state support." "You know I can't do that, Tom." Jim's voice was quiet but firm. "Harvest starts tomorrow. 30 local families depend on our storage facilities for their crops." The silence on the line spoke volumes. Tom had served with Jim before the explosion, knew what he was capable of. But that was before the wheelchair. Before everything changed. "Just be careful," Tom finally said. "These aren't just troublemakers. They're trained, organized, and they're targeting people who can't fight back." Jim's lips curved in a slight smile. "Everyone can fight back, Tom. It's just a matter of knowing how." After ending the call, Jim wheeled himself to the barn where David was checking the harvest equipment. The young man had been a godsend these past years, never treating Jim with pity, just respect. "Everything ready for tomorrow?" Jim asked, though he already knew the answer. His attention to detail hadn't diminished with his mobility. "Yes, sir," David nodded. "Mike Cooper called, said he'll bring his first loads around dawn. Linda's sending extra hands from the store to help with sorting." The community's support still humbled Jim sometimes. After the explosion, when some suggested he couldn't run the farm from a wheelchair, it was his neighbors who rallied around him. They saw past his disability to the man who had given 20 years of his life to protecting others. Sarah joined them, clipboard in hand. Like her father, she believed in precise preparation. "Dad, about these rebels." "We'll handle it," Jim assured her, though his mind was already gaming out scenarios. The farm's layout, which most would see as a liability for someone in his condition, actually provided tactical advantages he'd recognized during his rehabilitation. The morning progressed with deceptive normalcy. Local farmers dropped by to confirm harvest schedules, each bringing subtle warnings about rebel sightings moving closer to Pine Valley. Jim received each piece of information with the same quiet attention that had made him legendary in special forces. What their visitors didn't notice was how he was already preparing, how each conversation included careful instructions about alternate delivery routes, how Sarah and David were quietly moving valuable equipment to more defensible locations, how Jim's wheelchair now carried certain modifications that Dr. Parker had helped design, ones that had nothing to do with mobility. Linda Martinez arrived around noon, ostensibly to discuss storage arrangements for her market's grain supply. Her real purpose was evident in the worry lines around her eyes. "Jim, people are scared," she admitted, watching him maneuver his chair with precise control through the barn. "These rebels, they're not just stealing. They're sending a message about strength and weakness, about who they think can and can't defend themselves." "Then maybe it's time someone sent them a different message," Jim replied, his voice carrying an edge that reminded Linda of why local veterans still spoke his name with reverence. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek Farm, Jim made his final preparations. Sarah found him by the old oak tree, where Emily's memorial stone stood among the wildflowers. "Mom would say you're being stubborn," she said softly, resting her hand on his shoulder. "Your mother would be right," Jim smiled, "but she'd also understand. This farm, this community, it's worth protecting. Sometimes the best way to prevent violence is to be prepared for it." The distant sound of motorcycles echoed across the valley, carried on the October wind. Jim's expression didn't change, but his hands moved to the custom controls of his wheelchair with practiced precision. The rumble of motorcycles grew louder as Jim Wilson positioned his wheelchair near the barn entrance. Years of tactical experience had taught him to use terrain to his advantage. The barn's wide doorway gave him clear sightlines while providing cover. Sarah and David had retreated to their predetermined positions, following the protocols Jim had drilled into them over the past year. "Just like we practiced," he'd reminded them. "No heroics. Let them think they're in control." The first riders appeared through the morning haze, their bikes kicking up dust along the farm's main road. Jim counted 12 machines, with more. Engine sounds suggesting others holding back. Standard tactical deployment for an intimidation run. Their formation was too precise for ordinary troublemakers, confirming Tom's intelligence about their military background. Marcus "Snake" Reed led the column, his massive bike adorned with stolen military insignias. Behind him, Jake "Wolf" Carter and Ray "Viper" Thompson flanked the formation, their movements showing the kind of coordination that came from combat experience gone wrong. Jim's trained eye caught other details, the way they scanned sectors, their spacing, the subtle hand signals. These weren't just rebels, they were trained veterans who had lost their way. In another life, he might have commanded men like these. The bikes circled the farmyard in a choreographed display of power before cutting their engines. The sudden silence felt heavier than the rumble had been. "Nice setup you've got here," Snake called out, dismounting with practiced arrogance. His eyes took in the wheelchair with poorly disguised contempt. "Shame if anything happened to it." Jim kept his voice calm, his hands relaxed on his chair's controls. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" "Actually," Snake approached, combat boots crunching on gravel, "we're here to help you. Way we see it, a man in your condition might have trouble protecting his property. We offer security services for folks who need extra protection." Behind him, several riders had begun spreading out, taking positions that would have been tactically sound if they were dealing with an ordinary farmer. "That's thoughtful of you," Jim replied mildly, "but we manage just fine." Wolf stepped forward, his scarred face twisted in a sneer. "Do you now?" Because from where I'm standing, all I see is a cripple in a fancy chair and a bunch of valuable equipment that'd be real easy to relocate. Jim noticed how some of the younger rebels shifted uncomfortably at Wolf's words. Not all of them had fully embraced the group's methods. His attention focused on one in particular, Chris "Scorpion" Morgan, whose bearing screamed, "Recent combat veteran," and whose eyes held more uncertainty than malice. "Before you make any decisions," Jim's voice carried easily across the yard, "you might want to ask yourselves why a disabled farmer would install military-grade surveillance cameras around his property." That caught their attention. Snake's head snapped up, finally noticing the carefully concealed devices. His expression shifted from contempt to something more cautious. "You've got some interesting equipment for a farmer," he observed, almost like someone with experience in security. "Everyone has a past," Jim acknowledged. "The question is whether you want it to become relevant to your future." The implied threat wasn't lost on the more experienced rebels. Wolf's hand drifted toward his jacket, but Snake held up a warning hand.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Something in Jim's demeanor had triggered his combat instincts. "Check the barn," he ordered two of his men. They moved toward the structure, but Jim's voice stopped them. "I wouldn't. The floor's been recently treated with a specialized coating, very sensitive to weight distribution. One wrong step, and the sheriff gets an automatic alert." It was a bluff, but one based on their own assumptions. They were already seeing hidden threats. Let them build on that fear. "You're starting to sound less like a farmer and more like someone we should know about." Snake's voice carried a new edge. "Who are you, really?" "Just a man protecting what's his," Jim replied. "The same thing you all probably joined the service to do before you lost your way." That struck a nerve. Several rebels exchanged glances, particularly the younger ones. Jim pressed his advantage. "I see the unit patches you're trying to hide under those rebel badges. 75th Rangers, 10th Mountain Division. Good units, honorable service. Is this really how you want to dishonor that legacy?" Snake's face darkened with rage. "You don't know anything about us, old man. About what we've seen, what we've lost." "I know enough," Jim cut him off, his voice taking on a command tone that made several rebels straighten instinctively. "I know you're using tactical formations that went out of date 5 years ago. I know 3 of your bikes have non-standard exhaust modifications favored by the 3rd group. And I know your hands drifting toward a concealed weapon in a shoulder rig, though you haven't committed to drawing yet." The yard fell silent as his words sank in. Even Snake seemed taken aback by the precise assessment. "Who are you?" This time, the question carried real wariness. Jim's wheelchair hummed softly as he moved forward slightly into a shaft of sunlight. "Someone who understands loss. Who knows what it's like to have everything changed in an instant, but also someone who remembers what it means to serve with honor." His words seemed to hang in the autumn air. In the distance, a tractor's engine rumbled. Local farmers going about their honest work, the kind of people these men had once sworn to protect. "Last chance." Jim's voice was quieter now, but carrying that same command authority. "Leave my farm. Rethink your path. Because if you choose to escalate this situation, you'll learn exactly why this wheelchair doesn't make me any less dangerous." Snake's response came in the form of a harsh laugh, but Jim noted the uncertainty in his eyes. 20 years in Special Forces had taught him to read people in moments of pressure, to see the hairline cracks in their confidence. "Big words from a man who can't even stand up," Snake sneered, but his hand had moved away from his concealed weapon. "Boys, check the storage buildings. Let's show this crippled farmer what real power looks like." As several rebels moved toward the buildings, Jim's voice cut through the tension. Second warning, and you won't get a third. Those buildings house grain for 30 local families. Walk away now, and we can pretend this never happened. Or what? Wolf stepped forward aggressively. You'll roll over our toes? Jim's smile didn't reach his eyes. 8 seconds. 8 seconds till what? Snake demanded. Till you realize you're standing in a kill zone. The words had barely left his mouth when hidden sprinklers activated, spraying the area between the rebels and the storage buildings. What looked like water caught the morning light strangely. That's not water, Jim informed them calmly. It's a specialized marking compound, military grade, the kind that shows up under UV light and doesn't wash off for weeks, the kind law enforcement uses to track people. Several rebels backpedaled, suddenly unsure. They'd come expecting to intimidate a helpless farmer, not face military-grade countermeasures. You're bluffing, Snake declared, but his voice carried a note of doubt. Am I? Jim's wheelchair hummed softly as he adjusted position. Check. Your boots. Notice how the liquid's already changing color. In about an hour, everyone marked by that spray will be traceable anywhere in 3 counties. Every police station, every checkpoint, every security camera with a UV sensor will know exactly who tried to raid this farm. It was a mix of truth and tactical deception, something Jim had excelled at in his former life. The sprinklers did contain a marking compound, but its effectiveness was far less dramatic than he implied. The real power lay in making them believe, in using their own paranoia against them. The thing about specialized training, Jim continued conversationally, noting how the younger rebels were already examining their clothes with growing concern, is that it teaches you to use everything at your disposal. Even limitations become advantages if you think tactically. His wheelchair moved again, a precise adjustment that put him in a better position relative to Snake's group. The movement seemed casual, but anyone with combat experience would recognize the deliberate positioning. Chris "Scorpion" Morgan, the younger veteran Jim had noticed earlier, suddenly spoke up. Snake, those camera angles, they're covering every approach. No blind spots. This isn't random placement. Finally, Jim nodded approvingly, someone's paying attention. You've got good instincts, son, better than your current company deserves. Snake's face contorted with rage. Shut up. You don't know anything about us, about what we've been through. I know enough, Jim interrupted, his voice taking on a different tone, one that made several rebels snap to attention unconsciously. I know you're using these men's pain for your own purposes, taking good soldiers who lost their way and turning them into thugs. His words struck home. Several rebels shifted uncomfortably, especially the younger ones who still carried themselves with military bearing. You want to know what I know about loss? Jim's voice carried across the farmyard. 3 years ago, I was commanding a special forces unit in terrain very much like this. An IED took my legs. And my wife, who was volunteering at a nearby medical station, had to learn how to live again, how to be a father to my daughter from this chair. The revelation hung in the autumn air. Even Snake seemed taken aback, recognition finally dawning in his eyes. Wilson, he breathed. James. Wilson, Sierra team. Jim inclined his head slightly. Nice to be remembered. The name rippled through the group of rebels. Several of the veterans stepped back, their expressions shifting from contempt to something closer to awe. Sierra team was legendary in certain circles, the unit that had revolutionized rural counterinsurgency tactics. If you're who they say you are, Wolf challenged, though his voice held less conviction. Prove it. Tell us something only Sierra team would know. November 2019, Kandahar province, Jim replied without hesitation. A group of insurgents tried to use local farming communities as cover. Sierra team developed a new protection protocol, one that's still classified, but I'm betting some of you have heard rumors about it. Several rebels nodded slowly. The operation had become almost mythical among special operations forces, a textbook example of protecting civilians while neutralizing threats. "That was you?" Chris asked, his young face showing open admiration now. "Sir, they taught us about those tactics in advanced training. They said the commander was what?" Snake cut him off sharply. "A legend? A hero? Look at him now. Whatever he was, he's just a cripple in a chair defending a worthless farm." But Jim saw the fear behind Snake's bravado. The rebel leader was losing control of his men, watching as their respect shifted away from him. "You're right about one thing," Jim acknowledged. "I am defending a farm, but you're wrong about why." His wheelchair moved again. Another precise, tactical adjustment. "I'm defending it because that's what soldiers are supposed to do. Protect people, not terrorize them. Something you seem to have forgotten." The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows across the farmyard. In the distance, the sound of approaching vehicles caught everyone's attention. "That'll be Sheriff Anderson," Jim informed them, "former Force Recon, along with about a dozen local veterans who still remember what service really means. So you have a choice to make, a real choice, not the false ones you've been offering others." The approaching vehicle's rumble grew louder, but Snake wasn't ready to concede defeat. His face twisted with a desperate kind of rage, the kind Jim had seen too often in men who felt their control slipping away. "You think a few cop cars change anything?" Snake snarled. "We've dealt with local law enforcement before. They're not prepared for what we can do." "That's your second tactical error today," Jim replied calmly, his wheelchair humming as he made another precise adjustment. "First was assuming I was helpless. Second is assuming you know what's coming." As if on cue, the first vehicle crested. The hill, not a police cruiser, but a muddy pickup truck. Behind it came others, each carrying men Jim had served with, trained with, or helped after their own returns from combat. "Remember what I said about community?" Jim's voice carried across the increasingly tense farmyard. "These aren't just farmers or deputies. These are warriors who chose to build rather than destroy. Men who found their way back to what service really means." The trucks began forming a perimeter, their drivers and passengers emerging with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of military experience. Tom Anderson's police cruiser pulled up last, the sheriff stepping out with the casual confidence of someone who had assessed and dismissed multiple threats. "Looking good, Jim," Tom called out, his hand resting casually near his sidearm. "Having a party without inviting me?" Snake's eyes darted between the newcomers, his tactical training recognizing the expertise in their positioning. These weren't random reinforcements. This was a coordinated response by experienced veterans. "Last chance," Jim addressed the rebels, his voice carrying that quiet authority that had once commanded elite units. "Look around you. Really look. What do you see?" Chris Scorpion Morgan was the first to understand. "A counterinsurgency setup," he breathed, "just like the Sierra Team protocols. Multiple layers of containment, no direct confrontation unless necessary." "Good eye," Jim nodded. "Seems those training manuals taught you well. What else?" "Community defense," another rebel spoke up, a former Army Ranger by his bearing. "Local forces with intimate knowledge of the terrain, coordinated response." "Keep going," Jim encouraged, watching Snake's face darken as his men began analyzing the situation with their military training rather than their rebel mindset. "No shots fired," Chris continued, his voice growing stronger. "No direct threats. You're giving us every chance to walk away, just like the manual says. Minimize casualties, maximize potential for rehabilitation," Jim finished, "for finding a better path. Because that's what real warriors do. We protect, we rebuild, we help others find their way back." Snake's control was visibly crumbling as more of his men began to see the situation through their military training rather than their anger. "You're all weak," he shouted, Letting a cripple and some farmers tell you what honor means? We make our own rules now. Do you? Jim's question cut through Snake's rage. Or are you just running from the rules you swore to uphold? The ones about protecting the innocent, about using your strength to defend, not terrorize? Tom stepped forward, his sheriff's badge catching the morning light. I've got files on every farm you've raided, every family you've threatened. Could arrest you all right now, but that's not why we're here, is it, Jim? No, Jim agreed, his wheelchair moving to face the rebels directly. We're here because every man in this group took an oath once. An oath to protect, to serve, to stand between innocent people and those who'd harmed them. And somewhere along the way, you forgot what that meant. The autumn wind carried the scent of fresh earth and growing things across the farmyard. In the distance, the regular rhythm of farm machinery continued, a reminder of the peaceful life these men had threatened. I lost my legs defending what that oath stands for, Jim continued. Lost my wife, nearly lost my reason for living. But you know what I didn't lose? My understanding of what it means to be a warrior. It's not about having power. It's about how you use it. Chris was the first to step away from the rebel group, removing his leather vest with deliberate movements. He's right, the young veteran declared. This isn't what I fought for, not what any of us fought for. Traitor! Snake reached for his concealed weapon, but found himself suddenly surrounded by 3 local veterans who had moved with the silent efficiency of their training. That's the thing about tactical positioning, Jim commented mildly. While you were focused on me, real warriors were getting into place, just like we taught in those manuals you apparently didn't read carefully enough. More rebels began removing their vests, the spell of Snake's leadership broken by the combination of Jim's quiet authority and the reality of their situation. The former Army Ranger spoke up next. Sir, he addressed Jim directly, military bearing returning to his posture. Some of us, we just needed a purpose. After coming home, everything seemed empty, Jim finished. Meaningless compared to what you'd done, what you'd seen. His understanding drew more rebels away from Snake's influence. That's why we're here. Not to arrest you, though we could, but to show you another way. As more rebels stepped away from Snake's influence, the morning light seemed to shift, highlighting the stark contrast between those choosing redemption and those still clinging to their misguided path. Snake, now backed by only Wolf and 2 others, watched his authority crumble with increasing desperation. You think this changes anything? Snake's voice carried a dangerous edge. You think some speech about honor from a broken soldier makes up for what the world did to us? Broken? Jim's quiet laugh held no humor. Son, I commanded elite units from mountains higher than you've ever climbed. Lost my legs and learned to be more effective from this chair than most are on their feet. You want to talk about broken? Look in the mirror. Tom Anderson stepped forward, his sheriff's badge catching the sunlight. Every man here has lost something. The difference is what we chose to do with that loss. The local veterans who had responded to Jim's call formed a loose circle around the farmyard, their presence both cautionary and supportive. Among them stood former Marines, Rangers, regular army, men who had found their way back from their own dark places. You're not the first to lose your way, Jim continued, his wheelchair moving with tactical precision as he addressed the remaining rebels. After the explosion, I wanted to burn the world down. Rage is easier than healing. Destruction simpler than rebuilding. Chris, the young veteran who had first broken away, spoke up. Sir, when you say there's another way, what exactly do you mean? Jim's eyes never left Snake as he answered. Look around you. This farm employs 6 local veterans. The equipment maintenance is handled by former combat engineers. Our security systems, the ones you noticed earlier, were designed by a Marine who couldn't adjust to civilian tech jobs. Community Support Network, one of the reformed rebels realized aloud. Just like the stabilization protocols we used. Overseas. Exactly, Tom confirmed. We've built something here, a way for veterans to use their skills to protect and build rather than threaten and destroy. Snake's face contorted with rage. Built something? You built a cage, keeping warriors chained to farms and small-town rules when we should be taking what we deserve. And there it is, Jim's voice cut through Snake's outburst. The real difference between warriors and thugs. We protect what others build. You don't think you deserve to take it. Wolf, still standing by Snake's side, showed the first signs of uncertainty. But what about respect? In the service, we were somebody. Now we're just what? Jim interrupted. The men and women here run successful businesses, protect their communities, train others. They've earned something better than fear. They've earned real respect. More rebels shifted away from Snake, drawn by the vision of purpose without violence. Jim noticed how they unconsciously straightened their postures, military bearing returning as their better natures awakened. This is your chance, Jim addressed them collectively. Not just for redemption, but for something you've been missing. Legitimate purpose, real brotherhood, the kind that builds instead of destroys. Sarah emerged from her hiding place, carrying a folder filled with papers. Her appearance made Snake tense, but multiple veterans moved to protective positions with practiced ease. Everyone who wants a different path, she announced clearly. We have immediate openings. Farm work, security design, equipment maintenance, training positions, real jobs using your real skills. The transformation in the farmyard was almost visible. Former rebels stood straighter, their faces showing the first glimmers of hope. Some had felt in years. Even one of Snake's last supporters stepped away, removing his rebel vest. Sir, Chris addressed Jim, those tactical innovations we heard about from Sierra team, would you be willing to teach us? Not for fighting, but for legitimate security work. That's the plan, Jim nodded. Tom's already approved a private security training program. Everything legitimate, everything focused on protection rather than intimidation. Snake, watching his influence dissolve, made one last desperate play. They're weakening you, he shouted at his former followers, making you forget what real power feels like. No, Jim's voice carried the weight of command. They're remembering what real strength is. The strength to protect rather than threaten, to build rather than destroy, to find purpose in peace rather than chaos. As if to punctuate his words, the distant sound of farm machinery echoed across the fields. Honest work, legitimate purpose, real contribution to community. Each of you has a choice to make, Jim continued. Not just about today, but about who you want to be moving forward. The men behind me, they made that choice, found their way back from their own dark places, learned that real power isn't about making others fear you, it's about making their lives better. Snake's final act of defiance came with the swift, desperate movement of a cornered animal. His hand flashed toward his concealed weapon, but before anyone else could react, Jim's wheelchair had already moved. The motion was so smooth, so precisely calculated, that it seemed almost choreographed. That's your third tactical error today. Jim's voice remained calm, even as his chair positioned itself at the perfect angle to control the situation. You're still thinking like someone fighting a disabled veteran. You never stopped to ask why a Special Forces commander in a wheelchair would let you get this close without a plan. The rebel leader's hand froze halfway to his weapon as he realized his situation. The wheelchair's position had created a natural bottleneck, and the morning sun now blinded anyone trying to look in Jim's direction. It was the kind of tactical advantage that came from years of adapting, of turning apparent weakness into strength. You know what the biggest lesson I learned after losing my legs? Jim continued conversationally, though his eyes never left Snake's hand. It's not about what you can't do anymore. It's about finding new ways to do what needs to be done. Tom had his weapon drawn but held his fire, recognizing that Jim was handling more than just a physical threat. This was about redemption, about showing lost warriors a better path. In the field, Jim addressed the gathered veterans, both reformed rebels and local defenders. We learned to use every advantage, every piece of terrain, every apparent limitation. Who remembers the first rule of adaptive tactics? Turn disadvantage into opportunity, Chris answered immediately, his training resurfacing. Use the enemy's assumptions against them. Exactly, Jim nodded. Everyone who looked at this wheelchair saw weakness. Never occurred to them that I'd spent 3 years turning it into a tactical position, that every modification, every movement, would be planned and practiced until it was second nature. Wolf, still standing near Snake, but looking increasingly uncertain, spoke up. The way you position yourself. It's not random, is it? Every move has been calculated, Jim finished. Just like every security camera, every sprinkler placement, every apparent vulnerability on this farm, you thought you were attacking a disabled farmer. Instead, you walked into a demonstration of adaptive warfare techniques that aren't even declassified yet. Snake's face contorted with a mixture of rage and dawning comprehension. This whole time, you've been teaching, Jim stated, simply. Just like I did for 15 years before the explosion. Every move, every position, every response has been a lesson in how real warriors adapt, overcome, and maintain their honor. Sarah emerged from the barn carrying more folders, her movements showing the same practiced awareness her father had taught her. We have the training schedules ready, she announced, for those who want to learn legitimate adaptive tactics and security techniques. The remaining rebels, except for Snake and Wolf, moved toward her with almost magnetic attraction. The promise of legitimate training, of using their skills for protection rather than intimidation, proved stronger than any loyalty to their former leader. You're all weak, Snake's shout carried more desperation than conviction now. Giving up real power for what? Jim interrupted. For purpose? For respect that's earned rather than forced? For the chance to be warriors again instead of thugs? His wheelchair hummed softly as he made another precise adjustment. Look around you, son. Really look. What do you see? The morning light illuminated a scene of transformation. Former rebels stood straighter, their military bearing returning as they gathered around Sarah and Tom, discussing training schedules and job opportunities. Local veterans moved among them, sharing stories of their own journeys back from darkness. I see betrayal, Snake snarled, but his voice wavered. No, Jim corrected quietly. You see healing. You see men remembering who they were meant to be, who they can be again. Wolf finally stepped away from Snake's side, his movement deliberate and decisive. He's right, the scarred veteran admitted. We lost our way, tried to fill the void with fear and power, but this... He gestured at the farm, at the community of veterans working together. This is what we were trained for. To protect, to build, to serve with honor. Snake's hand finally moved away from his weapon as the last of his influence crumbled. He stood alone now, watching as his former followers embraced a different path. It's not too late, Jim offered, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had once commanded elite units. Even for you, especially for you, because I recognize that look in your eyes, the same one I saw in my mirror after losing my legs. The rage, the need to make others feel as powerless as you do. The autumn wind carried the scent of fresh earth. Across Willow Creek Farm, a Snake stood alone, watching his former followers embrace a different path. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmyard, highlighting the stark contrast between the man he had become and the soldier he once was, "You know what I see when I look at you?" Jim's voice was quieter now, meant for Snake alone. "I see what I could have become. After the explosion, after losing Emily, after everything, rage was easier than healing, destruction simpler than rebuilding." Snake's shoulders tensed, but something in Jim's words seemed to reach past his defenses. "How?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "How did you choose differently?" "Because of her." Jim nodded toward Sarah, who was still organizing training schedules with the reformed rebels. "My daughter needed more than my anger. She deserved more than watching. Her father destroy himself with bitterness." Tom Anderson stepped closer, holstering his weapon. "We all had that choice to make, after coming home, after seeing things no one should see. You either let the darkness consume you, or you find a way to create light." Around them, the transformation continued. Former rebels gathered in small groups with local veterans, sharing stories of their service, their struggles, their desire to find purpose again. Chris had already begun discussing security system modifications with one of the farm's regular workers, his tactical knowledge finding legitimate application. "Your men are finding their way back," Jim observed. "The question is, are you brave enough to follow them?" Snake's hand, which had never fully moved away from his concealed weapon, finally dropped to his side. "I was Force Recon," he said suddenly, as if the admission was pulled from deep inside him. "2 tours. After the last one, everything here seemed meaningless. Civilian life felt like a cage." "So you built a different cage," Jim finished. "One made of fear and power. But look at your men now. Really look. Which ones seem more free? The ones clinging to violence or the ones remembering their true purpose?" The farm's regular activities had begun to resume around them. Tractors moved in the distant fields, their steady rhythm a reminder of the peaceful life these men had nearly destroyed. David Murphy, Jim's trusted farmhand, was showing several former rebels the farm's equipment maintenance facility, their military engineering experience already, finding practical application. "We've got 20 acres of prime farmland waiting to be developed," Jim continued. "Need someone with tactical experience to help design the security systems, someone who understands both protection and agriculture." Snake's head snapped up, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you purpose," Jim corrected. "The same thing you've been trying to give your men, just pointed in a better direction. Those tactical skills you've been using to intimidate, they could be protecting food supplies for 3 counties. Linda Martinez arrived from her market, bringing coffee and food for everyone. She moved among the gathered veterans without fear, now seeing not threats but neighbors finding their way home. The choice is yours," Jim added, watching Snake process this new possibility. "But remember, true leadership isn't about making people fear you. It's about showing them a better path." Wolf, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. "Snake." "Marcus." He used his former leader's real name for the first time in years. "Remember why we enlisted in the first place? It wasn't to terrify civilians. We wanted to protect people, to serve something bigger than ourselves." The use of his real name seemed to strike Snake like a physical blow. Marcus Reed, the name he'd carried before rage and bitterness had transformed him into something else. "The hardest battle," Jim said softly, "isn't fighting against others. It's fighting against what pain and loss try to turn us into. Trust me, I fight that battle every morning when I wake up in this chair." Sarah approached, carrying one last folder. "We have a detailed proposal," she said, offering it to Snake. "Security systems design, tactical training for legitimate farm protection, coordination with local law enforcement. Everything legitimate. Everything focused on protection rather than intimidation." Snake, Marcus, stared at the folder for a long moment. Around him, his former followers were already integrating into their new roles. Chris was sketching security modifications for the grain storage. Wolf was discussing patrol routes with Tom. Even the youngest rebels were finding places where their skills could serve rather than threaten. "You're not the first to lose your way," Jim told him. "But the mark of a true warrior isn't never falling. It's having the courage to get back up, to remember who you were meant to be." The morning sun had risen higher, burning away the last of the autumn mist. In its clear light, Snake looked older, more vulnerable, the fierce facade cracking to reveal the lost soldier beneath. "I don't know if I can go back," he admitted, "to being Marcus, to being normal." "Normal?" Jim's laugh held genuine amusement. "Son, look around you. I run a tactical farming operation from a wheelchair. Tom combines sheriff duties with veteran rehabilitation. We're not asking you to be normal. We're asking you to be honorable." The transformation of Marcus Reed began not with grand gestures, but with a simple action. His leather vest, symbol of the rebel leader Snake, slid from his shoulders and fell to the ground with a soft thud that seemed to echo across Willow Creek Farm. "I don't want your pity," he said gruffly, though his voice had lost its threatening edge. "Good," Jim replied, his wheelchair humming as he made another precise adjustment. "Because I'm not offering pity. I'm offering what every warrior needs. It in purpose, respect, and a chance to serve with honor again." Around them, the farm had become a hub of purposeful activity. Former rebels worked alongside local veterans, their military precision finding new application in productive tasks. Chris was already leading a team in upgrading the farm's security systems, his tactical knowledge now protecting food supplies instead of threatening them. "First thing we need," Jim continued as if Marcus's surrender was already a settled matter, "is a complete tactical assessment of our northern fields. 20 acres of potential, but the terrain presents unique security challenges. Someone with Force Recon experience would understand the implications." Marcus found himself automatically analyzing the landscape, his trained eye noting defensive positions and vulnerable points. "You'd need elevated observation posts," he said, before catching himself, "and the creek provides both opportunity and risk." Go on," Jim encouraged, sharing a knowing look with Tom. They both recognized the moment a warrior began finding his way back to legitimate purpose. "The natural elevation changes," Marcus continued, his military expertise surfacing through years of misdirected anger. "They could be used for protecting the crops, setting up legitimate security measures." Sarah approached with a tablet displaying satellite imagery of the farm. "We've been wanting to expand our storage facilities," she explained, her natural ease with the former rebel leader showing her father's influence. "But we need someone who understands both tactical security and agricultural requirements. Someone like a Force Recon veteran who grew up on a farm," Jim suggested mildly. Marcus's head snapped up. Did my homework?" Jim smiled. "Just like you should have done before trying to intimidate a special forces commander. Your family had a farm in Nebraska. You enlisted straight out of high school, served with distinction in Force Recon until Kandahar," Marcus finished quietly. "Lost my whole team. Came home to find the family farm foreclosed. Nothing left but training that didn't seem to matter anymore. So you found men who felt the same," Tom added, understanding in his voice. "Gave them structure, purpose, even if it was the wrong kind." Wolf, who had been listening nearby, joined them. "We needed something to fight for," he admitted, "even if it meant becoming the kind of people we once fought against." "Well," Jim's voice carried that quiet authority that had begun transforming lives since sunrise, "now you have something better to fight for. This farm feeds hundreds of families. The storage facilities protect grain supplies for 3 counties. Real purpose, real service. Linda Martinez arrived with fresh coffee, handling it out to former rebels and local veterans alike. "You should see what they've done with the farmers' market security," she told Marcus. "These boys have already redesigned the whole system, making people feel safe instead of afraid. Now that's real power." Marcus watched as Chris briefed a group of local farmers on basic security protocols. The young veteran's face shone with pride as he used his military knowledge to protect rather than intimidate. "Your men are finding their way back, Jimmy," observed. "The question is, are you ready to lead them in the right direction this time?" The morning sun had reached its full height, casting no shadows as Marcus surveyed what his rebel band had become. Engineers checking equipment with practiced precision. Tactical experts designing security systems for grain storage. Warriors remembering their true purpose. "It won't be easy," Marcus said finally, "changing everything we've become." "No," Jim agreed, "it won't. But neither was learning to command from this chair. Neither was choosing to build when everything in me wanted to destroy. The hardest battles are always the ones we fight within ourselves." David Murphy approached with building plans for the new storage facilities. "We could use someone with engineering experience," he said to Marcus. "Someone who understands both construction and security requirements." The former rebel leader found himself studying the plans with professional interest. "The foundation needs reinforcement here," he pointed, "and these access points could be better protected if you—" He caught himself again, but this time Jim just nodded encouragingly. "Go on, son. Show us how to make it better. That's what real warriors do. They protect, they improve, they build." 1 week after the confrontation at Willow Creek Farm, the transformation was already visible. The rebel motorcycles, once symbols of intimidation, now carried supplies and patrol equipment. Marcus Reed, no longer Snake, had traded his leather vest for work clothes that bore the farm's newly designed security division patch. Another feed truck coming in from the South Road. His voice crackled over the radio. "All business now. Chris, confirm the credentials while Wolf checks the manifest." Jim Wilson smiled as he watched from his wheelchair near the main barn. The same tactical precision that had once been used to threaten was now protecting vital food supplies. His daughter Sarah approached, clipboard in hand. "The security upgrades are ahead of schedule," she reported. "Marcus and his team have already reinforced 3 storage facilities and designed patrol routes that cover twice the area with half the manpower. Military efficiency," Jim nodded approvingly, "applied to the right purpose this time." The morning sun illuminated a scene that would have seemed impossible just days ago. Former rebels worked alongside local veterans, their combined experience creating something unprecedented, a farming operation protected by elite military expertise. Tom Anderson pulled up in his sheriff's cruiser, grinning as he watched Chris guide the feed truck through its security check. "You know what the county commissioner said when I showed him the new protection protocols? Said we might have just solved the rural security crisis nobody knew how to fix." Indeed, word had spread quickly about Willow Creek Farm's innovative approach. Other agricultural operations had already reached out, seeking advice on implementing similar systems. The very men who had once terrorized farmers were now teaching them how to protect their livelihoods. "Dad!" Sarah called out, hurrying from the communication center they'd set up in the old tool shed. "You need to see this." The monitors showed security footage from 3 counties away, another group of rebels approaching a small farm. But this time, something was different. Marcus stepped into the room just in time to see the footage. "Those are Jackson's boys," he said quietly, recognizing his former allies. "They haven't heard about what happened here." Jim's wheelchair hummed as he moved closer to the screens. "Then maybe it's time they learned. Tom, how fast can you get us there?" "Us?" Marcus asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Who better to show them a better path?" Jim replied. "You've walked it yourself this past week. Sometimes the most Powerful message comes from someone who's made the same journey. The response team assembled with military precision. Marcus and Wolf on motorcycles, their rebel appearance now masking legitimate purpose. Chris coordinating communications from the mobile unit they'd set up in Tom's police van. Local veterans in support positions, ready to demonstrate the strength of community. Remember, Jim instructed as they prepared to move out, our goal isn't to fight them, it's to show them what you've all discovered, that true strength comes from protecting, not threatening. Sarah helped her father into the specially modified truck they'd equipped for his needs. His wheelchair locked into a system that gave him full visibility and command capability. Some might have seen it as a limitation. Jim had turned it into a mobile command center. Just like old times, Tom grinned from the driver's seat. Sierra, team rolling out to protect the innocent. With some new additions, Jim added, watching Marcus and Wolf take point on their bikes. Sometimes the best defenders are the ones who understand the threat from the inside. The convoy moved out, presenting a striking image. Former rebels and local veterans united under the leadership of a special forces commander in a wheelchair. But the real power wasn't in their appearance. It was in the example they represented. Linda Martinez watched them leave from her market's doorway, remembering how recently she had feared the sound of approaching motorcycles. Now those same bikes carried men dedicated to protection rather than intimidation. "They're going to change everything, aren't they?" she asked David Murphy, who was helping load supplies for the mission. "They already have," David replied. "Not just here, but everywhere their story spreads. People need to see that change is possible, that it's never too late to choose a better path." The team maintained radio discipline as they approached their target location, but the atmosphere was different from military operations of their past. This wasn't about combat or confrontation, it was about redemption. "Contact," Marcus reported calmly. "6 bikes, same formation we used to use. They're setting up for an intimidation run." "Just like we did here," Wolf added, his voice carrying understanding rather than judgment. "Move into position," Jim commanded. "Remember, we're not here to fight. We're here to show them a better way." The morning sun cast long shadows across unfamiliar farmland as Jim Wilson's convoy approached the scene. Through the tactical cameras they'd mounted on Marcus and Wolf's bikes, they could see Jackson's rebel group setting up for their intimidation run. A pattern they knew all too well. "Just like looking in a mirror," Marcus commented quietly, watching his former allies repeat the same tactics he'd used barely a week ago. "Hard to believe we were that blind." "Not blind," Jim corrected from his command position. "Just lost. Like you were, like they still are." The target farm belonged to an elderly couple, the Hendersons, who'd worked the land for 40 years. Their grain storage facility served as a vital hub for local food distribution, exactly the kind of vulnerable point the rebels liked to exploit. "Multiple vectors of approach," Chris reported from the mobile command center, his tactical training now serving a protective purpose. "They're using our old formation, boss." Marcus nodded grimly. "Because I taught it to them. Jackson was one of my first recruits, another veteran who couldn't find his place back home." Jim's wheelchair hummed as he adjusted position in his modified command vehicle. "Then you're the perfect person to show him a better way. Move into position, but remember, we're not here to fight. We're here to demonstrate a better path." The rebel group had just begun their intimidation approach when Marcus and Wolf's bikes appeared, cutting through their formation with precise timing. The move was perfectly calculated, not threatening, but demonstrating superior tactical knowledge. "Jackson!" Marcus called out, using his former ally's real name, Michael Jackson, ex-Army Rangers. "We need to talk!" The rebel leader's bike skidded to a halt, his surprise evident even through his tough exterior. "Snake, what are you doing here? This is our territory now." "No," Marcus interrupted, removing his helmet to show his changed appearance. It's not territory. It's a community. One that needs protection, not intimidation. The other rebels circled uncertainly, their formation lacking its usual confidence. They could sense something was different about their former allies. That's when Jim's vehicle moved into position, commanding attention, not through intimidation, but through the quiet authority that radiated from its occupant. The wheelchair lift deployed smoothly, revealing the Special Forces commander who had changed everything at Willow Creek Farm. "Gentlemen," Jim's voice carried across the farmyard, "before you make the same mistakes others did at my farm last week, let me ask you something. Do you remember why you first put on a uniform? What it meant to serve with honor?" Jackson's face showed a flicker of recognition. Like many rebel leaders, he kept track of military legends. "Wilson? Sierra Team Wilson?" "The same," Jim confirmed. "Though these days I'm more concerned with protecting farms than commanding combat units, and I'm not alone." As if on cue, the rest of their convoy emerged. Local veterans, former rebels, all united in purpose. Among them, Chris stepped forward, his young face showing the conviction of someone who had found his true path. "A week ago, I was where you are," he addressed his former comrades. "Thinking power came from fear. Thinking we could fill the void inside us by making others feel as lost as we did." Wolf joined him, his scarred face carrying new dignity. "We were wrong. Real power, real purpose. It comes from protecting, not threatening, from building instead of destroying." Jackson's rebels shifted uneasily, their tough facades cracking as they recognized something in their former allies' transformation. One of them, a young veteran named Travis, spoke up hesitantly. "But what else is there for guys like us? Civilian life, it's just empty," Jim finished. "Meaningless compared to what you did in service?" His wheelchair moved forward, slightly. "Son, let me show you something." The tactical displays in their vehicles lit up, showing footage from Willow Creek Farm, former rebels working alongside local veterans, protecting vital resources, using their military skills for legitimate purpose. "This is what you were trained for," Jim continued. "Not terrorizing farmers, but protecting communities, using your skills to build something meaningful." Marcus approached his former friend Jackson directly. "Remember what we used to say in the service? About making a difference? This is our chance, not by intimidating civilians, but by becoming their guardians." Jackson's tough exterior wavered as he watched the footage. "You're saying there's a place for us? For our skills?" "More than a place," Jim assured him. "There's a mission. These farms, these communities, they need protection. Real protection from people who understand tactical operations and security protocols." The transformation that had begun at Willow Creek Farm started to spread across another farmyard. One by one, the rebels began to see themselves not as outsiders, but as potential protectors. 1 month after the confrontation at the Henderson farm, Jim Wilson sat in his wheelchair on the newly constructed observation platform overlooking Willow Creek Farm. The autumn harvest was in full swing, but it was the security operations that drew his attention. Former rebels, now trained protectors, coordinated with local veterans to safeguard not just his farm, but an entire network of agricultural operations. "Latest report from the Regional Coordination Center," Sarah approached, tablet in hand. 3 more rebel groups have reached out through Sheriff Anderson. They want to know if our rehabilitation program has space for their members. Jim smiled, watching Marcus direct a security drill with military precision. The former rebel leader had transformed his tactical knowledge into something constructive, teaching other veterans how to protect rather than intimidate. "Tell Tom we'll make space," he replied. "Every warrior who finds their way back helps others do the same." the changes had spread far beyond their initial expectations. What had started as a confrontation on one farm had evolved into a movement, transforming lost veterans into community guardians. The observation platform where Jim sat was itself a testament to this transformation. Designed by Chris, built by Wolf's construction team, and protected by security systems that Marcus had implemented. "Mr. Wilson," Linda Martinez's voice carried up from below. "The governor's office is on the line. They want to discuss implementing our veteran rehabilitation program statewide." The program had become their proudest achievement. Combining tactical training with legitimate security work, it gave troubled veterans a chance to use their military skills for positive purposes. The same expertise that had once been turned to intimidation now protected vital food supplies and essential infrastructure. Jackson, who had joined them after that day at the Henderson farm, approached with his daily security briefing. The former rebel leader now coordinated protection for a network of farms across 3 counties. "The new communication systems are online," he reported, standing at parade rest, old habits returning with renewed purpose. "We can now monitor and respond to security threats across the entire agricultural corridor." "And the training program?" Jim asked, though he already knew the answer from the pride in Jackson's bearing. 20 new recruits started this morning, sir. All veterans, all looking for the same thing we were. Purpose, brotherhood, a chance to serve with honor again. The transformation in these men still amazed Jim sometimes. He watched as Chris led a group of new arrivals, former rebels from other regions, through basic security protocols. The young veteran had found his calling as an instructor, helping others redirect their tactical knowledge toward protection. "Dad," Sarah interrupted gently, "Dr. Parker is here for your checkup." Bob Parker, who had helped design Jim's wheelchair modifications, now served as medical advisor for their expanding program. He understood that healing wasn't just physical. It was about finding purpose again. "Looking good, Jim," the doctor observed, checking his patient while watching the training session below. "Though I bet you never imagined your rehabilitation would lead to all this." Jim's laugh carried across the platform. "Funny how life works. Lost my legs, thought I'd lost everything. Instead, found a way to help others find their path again." Tom Anderson's police cruiser pulled up to the main gate, where Wolf's security team had implemented entry protocols that combined military precision with community awareness. The sheriff had become their strongest ally, helping legitimate the program in law enforcement circles. "Just got word from the FBI's Veteran Affairs Liaison," Tom announced, joining them on the platform. "They want to use our program as a model for addressing veteran displacement nationwide. Seems somebody finally realized that lost warriors need purpose, not punishment." The autumn sun cast long shadows across the farm as afternoon training continued. Marcus had developed a curriculum that combined tactical security with agricultural protection, teaching former rebels how to guard the communities they had once threatened. "You know what the best part is?" Chris asked, joining them after his training session. "When these guys realize they can use their military skills to protect people again. You can see it in their eyes. That moment when purpose comes back." Linda Martinez arrived with coffee. For everyone, no longer afraid of the men she now considered community guardians. "Had 3 more farms request security consultations this morning," she reported. "Words spreading about how well the protection program works." "Because it's not just about security," Jim observed. "It's about redemption, about giving lost warriors a chance to remember who they were meant to be." The observation platform had become a symbol of their transformation, a high point from which former rebels could watch over the community they now protected. Jim's wheelchair fit perfectly into the space, designed specifically for his command position. They're calling it the Wilson Protocol. Sarah shared, reading from her tablet. The combination of veteran rehabilitation and community protection. The governor wants to implement it across all agricultural regions. 1 year after rebels rode onto Willow Creek Farm, the autumn sun rose on a scene that would have seemed impossible that tense morning. The farm had transformed into a national training center for veteran rehabilitation and agricultural security. Jim Wilson's wheelchair left precise tracks along the newly paved paths as he made his way to the ceremony. "Ready for this, Dad?" Sarah asked, walking beside him. At 20, she'd grown into her role as program coordinator, helping transform her father's vision into a nationwide movement. "Born ready," Jim smiled, using the same words he'd spoken to the rebels a year ago, but this time they carried a different weight. The ceremony area was packed with faces that told the story of transformation. Marcus Reed, no longer Snake, stood at parade rest near the podium, his security team's uniform bearing the official insignia of the Wilson Protocol. Behind him, rows of graduates waited to receive their certifications, former rebels turned protectors, lost warriors who had found their way home. "Ladies and gentlemen," Governor Richardson began the ceremony. 1 year ago, this farm became the birthplace of something extraordinary. What began as a confrontation between rebels and a disabled veteran has evolved into a national model for veteran rehabilitation and rural security. The audience represented every aspect of their success. Linda Martinez sat with other local business owners who had watched their community transform from threatened to protected. Tom Anderson, now director of the state's Veteran Affairs Office, stood with law enforcement officials from across the country who had come to study their methods. "The Wilson Protocol," the governor continued, "has shown us that the solution to veteran displacement isn't punishment, it's purpose. These men and women didn't need our judgment. They needed a chance to serve with honor again." Jim's wheelchair hummed softly as he took his position near the podium. The same tactical precision that had once commanded Special Forces units now directed a different kind of mission, one of redemption and renewal. Chris, now chief instructor of their training program, stepped forward to present the graduation statistics. "This year alone, we've helped 300 veterans transition from displacement to purposeful service. Our security networks protect agricultural operations in 12 states, with a 0% incident rate." Wolf, heading the construction division, had turned his team's skills to building rather than intimidation. Their defensive installations and observation posts had become models for agricultural security nationwide. "But the numbers tell only part of the story," Jim addressed the gathering, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had first turned enemies into allies. "The real success is in the lives transformed, the purpose restored, the honor reclaimed." Jackson, who had once led rival rebels, now coordinated their expanding operations across multiple states. "We're not just protecting farms," he explained to the assembled media. "We're showing other lost warriors that there's a path back to meaning, to brotherhood, to serving with honor." The ceremony included something unprecedented: the official recognition of their security force by federal agencies. The Department of Agriculture had adopted their protocols nationally, while the VA integrated their rehabilitation methods into veterans support programs. "A year ago," Marcus spoke, his voice steady with newfound purpose, "I was leading men down a path of destruction. Today, we're building something, protecting something, making a real difference." Dr. Parker, who had helped design Jim's wheelchair modifications, now headed a specialized medical unit supporting their expanded operations. "The physical rehabilitation is important," he shared, "but the psychological healing that comes from purposeful service, that's the real miracle we're seeing here." As the new graduates received their certifications, each one told a story of transformation, Former rebels who now protected the communities they had once threatened. Lost warriors who had found their way back to honor. Veterans who had discovered that their military skills could serve a greater purpose. You know what makes this work? Jim asked the audience. It's not just the training or the opportunities, it's understanding that every warrior needs a mission. We're not asking these men and women to forget their military experience. We're helping them use it for its highest purpose, protecting others. The autumn wind carried the scent of freshly harvested crops across the ceremony grounds. In the distance, security teams maintained their vigilant watch, their presence now bringing comfort rather than fear to the community. Sarah presented the final statistics. Over 1,000 farms protected, dozens of rebel groups transformed into security forces, and a national network of veteran support that continued to grow. This isn't the end of our mission, Jim concluded. It's just the beginning. Every day, more veterans find their way to our doors, looking for what these graduates have found. Not just employment, but purpose. Not just training, but transformation. As the ceremony ended, Jim's wheelchair moved to the observation platform, his command post for a different kind of campaign. Below him, new recruits trained alongside experienced instructors, while security teams coordinated protection for the vital agricultural networks that fed the nation. You know what I see when I look out there? He asked Sarah, watching the complex operation they'd built together. I see proof that no warrior is ever truly lost. They just need someone to remind them of who they were meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story about the power of transformation and the strength that comes from understanding our true purpose.